This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive scottishvisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast that gives you an overview of the whole of Scotland, its unique landscape, its people and its history, as we travel together through the cities, the tiny villages, narrow roads and uneven tracks all over this amazing country. Today I'm broadcasting this from my study in Aberlady, a small village about 20 minutes east of Edinburgh. For February it's mild with temperatures around 10 degrees centigrade, but we do have some showers, so a wee bit wet outside, especially for walking wee Minnie, our dog. This podcast is the first in a 4-part series on Edinburgh City, the capital of Scotland. In this series, I am going to cover the old and the new towns, followed by a tour of Edinburgh Castle, that fortified bastion sitting atop an extinct volcano, and finally we'll take a walk down the Royal Mile, the route from the top of the High Street by the castle all the way down to Holyrood Palace, effectively 1 mile distant. In the first 2 episodes, the old and the new town, we'll dive right into what makes this most gracious city so famous, and you'll find out in more detail as to why it has 2 parts, the old and the new. In simple terms, the rich and famous were fed up with living in the same dark, dingy apartments, cheek by jowl with the peasantry of Edinburgh, with its smells, dirt and disease. So they built a new town nearby and moved out. We will hear about some of the most famous people who lived in the new town, for example, Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, and Robert Louis Stevenson, one of Scotland's most famous writers, to name but a few. In this podcast on the Old Town, you will hear about the prominent landmarks such as St Giles Cathedral, whose cemetery was moved in its entirety after a major flood, and some gruesome finds when the coffins were moved. And why is John Knox, the great church reformer, the only person still to be buried there under the car park? You'll also hear about the Deacon Brodie pub, named after Deacon Brodie, gentleman by day and thief by night. And this extraordinary story was brought to light by Robert Louis Stevenson's book, Jekyll and Hyde. It's an amazing street with 16th and 17th century buildings still standing. Well, I think it's time to get the tour of the Old Town underway. And as always, it's great to share Scotland with you. Perhaps this podcast will whet your appetite to come and visit this fine country for yourself. And if you do, you will certainly be stopping in our capital city for a night or 2. If for some reason you can't come in person, then let me bring Scotland to you. To see some great photos of this city tour, have a look at my Facebook page or Instagram. And please visit my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. And if you go to the podcast page, you can email subscribe to ensure that you get notification of future episodes. Well, wherever you are in the world, I would now like you to relax and be transported to Scotland on this first part of our unique Scotland journey around Edinburgh's Old Town. I was driving into Edinburgh this morning from Aberlady, a small village about 20 miles east of Edinburgh, where I now live, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. I travel up the A1 road, and about 5 miles south of the city, just off to the right-hand side, I could see the sun bringing to life the volcanic hill right next to Holyrood Palace called Arthur's Seat. Now, who Arthur was has been lost in the mists of time, so I can't attribute the name to anyone in particular. But the sight of sun lighting up the rock faces of this volcanic crag was somewhat heartwarming as I headed into the heart of the city. Arthur's Seat is a definitive landmark of Edinburgh, and it must have been an absolute beacon to many travellers through the centuries who were making their way to the capital. In fact, Arthur's Seat is the highest of one of the 7 hills of Edinburgh. Perhaps Edinburgh is aspiring to recognition as a city with 7 hills similar to Rome, who knows? Anyway, with 7 hills it would be a pity not to take advantage of them, and in the true spirit of man conquering the elements, there's an annual running competition along the route of these hills. The record for completing this quite gruelling race is around 1 hour 45 minutes, and I have to say I smile to myself when I think how pleased I am if I walk up just one of these hills on a morning stroll with Minnie by my side. As well as Arthur's Seat, we have Castle Rock, probably the most famous natural rock structure in Scotland, due to the mighty Edinburgh Castle being built upon it. Castle Rock has survived the ravages of massive glaciers during the Ice Age, and that ended around 10,000 years ago. And as the glacier moved around Castle Rock, the typical crag and tail was formed. And on this crag and tail was built Edinburgh Old Town, with the castle at the top and Holyrood Abbey at the bottom. Distance approximately 1 mile, and that gives us the famous street name, the Royal Mile, between the 2 royal residences. The other 5 hills are Calton Hill, which towers over the new town and gives great views over the city, and it has some wonderful monuments up there commemorating the battles of Waterloo and Trafalgar. Blackford Hill, with its Royal Observatory. The Braid Hills, to the south of the city, gives fine views of the castle, and this is where I go to watch the annual fireworks display from Edinburgh Castle at the start of every new year. Then there's Gorstorphin Hill, the most westerly, with fine woodlands, with Edinburgh Zoo on the hill, and I know this well as I've climbed to the top many times with my son when he was a wee boy, and now with my grandchildren. And you get a great view over the River Forth. Last but not least are the Craiglockhart Hills, and as you walk to the summit you will pass the Craiglockhart War Hospital, which accommodated injured officers from the First World War. And I mention this because if you've heard of them, Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, famous poets from the First World War, well, they were treated here. But I digress. Before I go on to focus on the Old Town, let me tell you a little bit about Edinburgh itself. The oldest artefacts in the area date from around 8,500 years ago, and this ties in with hunter-gathering tribes who came north from Europe just after the last glaciers of the Ice Age receded around 10,000 years ago. The name Edinburgh comes from the Brittonic Celtic language. Eden was a district of a local Celtic tribe with Castle Rock at its centre, known as Dun Eden or Fortification of Eden. Now that was as early as the 1st century. Now from around the 10th century, the language changed from Cumbric to Northumbrian Old English, when the Brittonic Celtic word Dun, as in Dunedin, was replaced by Bur, thereby producing Edinburgh, or Edinburgh as we know it today. Okay, is all that clear? Today's population is around 750,000, including rural areas, whereas Glasgow has a population of around 1 million. And this reflects Glasgow's huge industrialisation of the late 18th to mid-20th century, where large numbers of people were required to work in the factories and mills as well as shipyards of the Clyde. There were also thousands of people flooding through Glasgow to join emigration ships, but many found jobs and never left, and therefore settling in Glasgow itself. Edinburgh, on the other hand, was a royal city, popular with kings and queens of Scotland, with its castle stronghold and the comfortable royal apartments at Holyrood Abbey from the 12th and 13th centuries. But this size comparison with Glasgow also provides an insight into the makeup of Edinburgh, which was, in medieval times, centred around the central spine of the city, which led from the castle to Holyrood Abbey, and this area was enclosed by a wall to protect its inhabitants. The entry to the city was controlled by gates or ports, and sections of this wall can still be seen today. If you looked at Edinburgh from above at that time, that was all that existed, apart from a few small settlements surrounding the Old Town. Today, if you hovered over the city, you would see the original Old Town, not much changed from the past, leading down the Crag and Tail, and, to the north, a large rectangular-shaped area where beautiful Georgian houses have been constructed. That is the New Town. And that's the beauty of Edinburgh, in that it's so easy to distinguish between the two parts. Admittedly, the city has sprawled north, south, east and west, but in simple terms, the construct revolves around the old and the new towns, which we will be visiting in this and the follow-on podcasts. So, what exactly is the Old Town? Well, I now return to the first hill I mentioned, and that is Castle Hill, where the castle proudly sits. From there, the road runs all the way down to Holyrood with buildings on either side, and alleyways or closes, that's C-L-O-S-E, closes, leading to the rear of the buildings. From above, it resembles a fishbone with the spine leading from the head down to the tail, where the ribs either side representing the alleyways, and these closes are sometimes no more than a few feet wide, and they lead down steeply on both sides to the flatter ground below, making it necessary to construct the buildings on steep-sided slope. So if you stand on the spine or the main street of the old town, the apartment buildings may be 4 or 5 stories high, but on the other side there may be 14 stories from the ground up. Well, our tour is going to start at the top, and we're going to begin at the castle, working our way down the Royal Mile, and I'll be commenting on the prominent buildings as we go. I won't be mentioning the closes, as those will be covered in my 4th Edinburgh podcast called A Walk Down the Royal Mile. So we'll start in front of the castle, and I always get a sense of awe when I stand in front of this amazing fortification with its imposing walkway over the dry moat leading to the impressive doors with statues of William Wallace and King Robert the Bruce on either side. And I look forward to taking you on a personal tour in my next but one podcast. With our backs to the castle entrance, we are now on the esplanade, or the open area to the front of the castle. You can tell by the castle's cannons facing the esplanade that this area needs defending in times of conflict. It is defended on its other 3 sides by an incredibly steep rock face, and as Castle Rock sits 450 feet above sea level, not an easy climb for invaders. Anyway, we turn our back away from the castle and make our way down the esplanade onto the top of the Royal Mile, or High Street. And before we get onto the Royal Mile, at the bottom of the esplanade on the left-hand side wall, you'll find a small well. And this is the Witches' Well, and witches were burned on this spot, and more of that to come shortly. As we step onto the upper Royal Mile, the street is cobbled and uneven, reflecting the age of this part of Edinburgh. Now, cobbles are small rectangular pieces of granite knitted together on the ground to make up the road, and must have been very welcome in the days when the roads were just dirt and mud. Today, as historically pleasing as it is to have them in view, they're often uneven, create trip hazards, and are very slippery in the wet weather, so beware the cobbles when you're visiting Edinburgh. The Royal Mile was divided into 4 streets, and they are Castle Street, where we are now, the Lawn Market, the High Street, and then Canongate. And as we walk forward into the Lawn Market, where some buildings have been preserved from the 17th century, we can reflect here why it was necessary for the great and good to move out of this old town into a new town below. When we look at 17th century Edinburgh, it was still surrounded by a huge wall, and due to the lack of land available for development, there was a need to build tenement-type houses, or houses with up to 14 stories high, to accommodate an increasing population. More than 55,000 people were crammed into this restricted space, which meant that every class of individual lived effectively side by side. In the cellars were the poorest, while the top of the buildings housed the middle classes. The upper classes, and even lords and the aristocracy, lived in the middle of the building. And these buildings were built close together with a narrow alleyway, or, as we've discovered, a close between them. No electricity, no running water, no toilets in the buildings, so the closes that ran all the way down from the High Street to the locks at the bottom of the hill were very convenient for depositing rubbish, garbage, and also, yes, wait for it, human waste from the chamber pots that would have been filled by families during the day. Those living on the lower floors would simply have stepped outside their houses and deposited the toilet waste in the alleyways and watched it run down the hill, while those at the top of the tenements would simply open a window and throw their disgusting contents into the close, splattering everything and anyone on its descent. Clearly, too many people were hit by this waste, including more prominent members of Edinburgh elite society, so, in 1749, a law was passed called the Nastiness Act. Yes, it's called the Nastiness Act, which decreed that human waste could only be tossed out of windows between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. the next morning. The person tossing the detritus was also supposed to shout, "Gardez l'eau," which is a derivation of a French phrase, "Gardez l'eau," which means watch out for the water. And all this waste descended or was brushed into the lochs below. The loch in the north was called the Norloch, and this loch was drained by the early 19th century to make way for the building of the bridges joining the old and the new towns, and more of that later. Visitors to Edinburgh today will be pleased to hear that every building has appropriate toilet facilities. But interestingly, the Nastiness Act has never been repealed. So if you do have the misfortune to have a chamber pot emptied upon your head in one of the closes off the Royal Mile, and the person that threw it did shout "Gardez-lou" between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m, then there's very little legally that you can do about it. So, as you can imagine, the stench from the closes and the heaving, stinking mess of the Norloch, living in such crammed conditions where sanitation was at its most basic and disease spread easily, this was a perfect reason for those who could afford it to move out. More of that move and the construction of the new town later, but before I digress further, we will walk all the way down the Lawn Market, past the Witchery restaurant on the right-hand side, the Camera Obscura, and the Hub Church, and we arrive at Milnes Court, and this is one of the closes I've talked about. From Milnes Court you'll arrive at James Court, where you'll find a much older looking building than those on the rest of the street. This is Gledstane's land, and the word land was a tenement or apartment block in those days, and you can identify this Gledstane's land by the golden hawk hanging outside. The significance of the hawk is that the old Scottish name for a hawk was a gled or a glede. The frontage dates from the early 17th century, renovated at the time by Thomas Gledstone, a wealthy merchant in the city. And if you go down one of the closest to the back of the building, this dates from the 15th and 16th centuries. However, for the best view of the building, it's better to cross the street and look at it from the other side, but beware the cobbles and the traffic coming from both directions. In the 1930s, the building was due for demolition, but it was rescued by the National Trust for Scotland and restored. During the restoration, some original Renaissance painted ceilings were uncovered. It's open to visitors and it gives a real insight into 17th century life, with open fires, no running water or toilets, and there's also some furniture of that period. At entry level, there's an arcade frontage and reconstructed shop booth, complete with replicas of 17th century wares. On the left of the building there's a curved stone four-stair with iron railings which leads from the street to a door at first floor level. There have been records of a building on this site since 1501, but the oldest part of the current building was constructed in the 1550s. Knowledge of this time period is limited, but we do know that Thomas Gledstone, the man the building gets its name from, didn't purchase the property till about 1617, when he started an extensive refurbishment programme up until around 1620. He bought the property with his wife Bessie Cunningham, with the intention of renting out the property on a floor-by-floor basis to wealthy upper-middle-class tenants. And it's likely that Thomas and Bessie lived on the third floor, due to the unique mural work and panels of various birds on the painted ceilings, and it is wonderful to see how the National Trust for Scotland has returned it to its former glory. Yet another must-visit when you're in Edinburgh. Well, continuing down the Lawn Market, we come to the traffic lights, and on the left-hand side is the Deacon Brodie's pub. Now, Deacon Brodie was a well-respected man in the town. He was actually a city councillor and also a deacon or president of Rites and Masons around 1781. He was himself a respected cabinet maker, and part of his duties was to repair and install locks in the grand houses. His connections in high society meant he had access to the homes of some of the richest members of that society. Unfortunately for Brodie, he also had a severe drinking problem and a gambling habit, and 2 mistresses, plus 5 children, and they were an expense he could not afford. So, to maintain this lifestyle, he was a respected and upstanding member of the community by day and a housebreaker and thief by night, using wax impressions of the keys he had provided in the new locks of his clients' houses. Of course, his thievery was not enough to feed his extravagant lifestyle, so, in 1786, to increase his takings, he stupidly recruited a gang of 3 thieves. John Brown, a thief on the run from a sentence of transportation, George Smith, a locksmith and grocer, and Andrew Ainsley, a shoemaker. This lucrative nighttime employment was quite a money spinner, but it ended 2 years later when he organised a break-in on the excise office in the Canongate. He'd already made a copy of the key earlier and sneaked in when the night watchman was meant to be out all evening. Unfortunately for the gang, he returned early, and Brodie and his gang had to make a quick escape with only a small sum of money. However, the authorities were alerted, and John Brown decided to give himself up for a king's pardon if he gave the names of the other robbers and showed them where to find the duplicate keys they had been using. Smith and Ainsley were arrested immediately, but Brodie did not wait around and he fled south, taking a ship to Holland. In the meantime, Brodie had written letters to his mistresses and entrusted these letters to a passenger on a ship heading for Edinburgh. This passenger, a Mr. Geddes, became suspicious and handed them over to the authorities on his return. Eventually, the Scottish authorities found Brodie in Amsterdam, Holland, where he was planning to flee to the United States. Having been caught, he was returned to Edinburgh for trial. His trial, and that of Smith, started on 27th of August 1788. Brown and Ainsley gave evidence against them both and received King's pardons. On 1st of October, both Brodie and Smith were found guilty and hanged at the old toll booth, which we'll see shortly, on the High Street, before a crowd of 40,000. It's said that he had actually designed the scaffold upon which he was hung. There were also rumours that he had made a steel collar which he wore around his neck, and that he bribed the hangman to cut him down quickly to save his life. It would appear that the plan failed, and he is actually buried in an unmarked grave at St Cuthbert's Church on Chapel Street. The moral of the story is, if you're going to rob, keep it to yourself. If you're found out, keep your whereabouts secret. If you have a mistress, tell her nothing, and certainly don't write to her if you're on the run. Well, this story gave the famous Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson the idea for his sensational book Jekyll and Hyde, and it's a must-read if you've not already done so. If you cross the road from the Deacon Brodie's pub, you'll find Brodie's Close, and there is normally a mannequin outside depicting Brodie himself. That was where he lived until his execution. We are now at the bottom of the Lawn Market, and at the lights you cross the road to continue down onto the High Street, and the first building you come to on the left-hand side is the High Court, and you can't miss it as there's a large statue of the famous philosopher David Hume just outside the front door. The High Court is Scotland's supreme criminal court. It oversees the most serious criminal cases such as murder and rape, with a single judge and jury consisting of 15 people. Now, if you end up here in front of a judge and jury, then you have definitely got on the wrong side of the law. Just down from the High Court is the fabulous St Giles Cathedral, a huge classical church building with a large crown spire. It sits as planned in the centre of the Old Town as a place of worship for Edinburgh. St Giles himself was the patron saint of lepers, beggars and the disabled, and as you go into the church, look up at the engraving and you will see St Giles holding a young deer and protecting it from some huntsmen. The early church was Romanesque architecture, but little remains other than fragments in the Albany aisle. The cathedral was rebuilt in the Gothic medieval style from the 14th to the 16th centuries, with renovations in later years leading to the latest additions of the Thistle Chapel built in 1911. This chapel is for the most ancient and most noble order of the Thistle. It's the highest heraldic order in Scotland. In fact, it's so high that the monarch, him or herself, is the one that nominates the individual. Today, St Giles Cathedral is a parish church of Scotland, and its correct title is the High Kirk of Edinburgh. Since the Reformation in 1560, the church has been Protestant, and there are no cathedrals in the Protestant religion. But to give the church its standing, and for historic reasons, it's retained its title. As you face the door of the church, walk to your left, and you'll find a heart made from cobbles on the ground. This is known as the Heart of Edinburgh, or its proper name is the Heart of Midlothian, and this is the spot where the old toll booth used to be. It was an administrative centre, a courtroom, a jail, and this is where executions took place, and this is where Deacon Brodie met his end. If you walk in the other direction, go around to your right, and you'll find yourself in a large car park, and the old Parliament building of Scotland is on your right. If you find car park number 23, you'll see a plaque on the ground showing that this is the site of burial of the religious reformer John Knox. An incredible man. He was one of the leaders of the Reformation who, in 1560, transformed Scotland from a Catholic country to a Protestant one. It was thought wise to retain Knox here when the cemetery was moved, and, in any case, his dying wish was to have a plain grave with no idolatrous embellishments. We will be visiting his house shortly, but before we move on, I want to tell you an awesome tale of death and burial in this very place that used to be the St Giles Cemetery or burial ground. And if you get scared easily, then fast forward. Otherwise, listen in. There used to be a cemetery on this site up until the 16th century. It was used for the entire population, and to save space, coffins were buried on top of each other until some were not far from the surface. One day, after torrential rain in Edinburgh, the streets flooded and a cascade of water poured down the Royal Mile. This water flooded the graveyard, and those coffins near to the surface popped out of the ground and floated down the high street. All coffins were retrieved, but some of the lids had fallen off and were gathered to be placed back over the coffins. When the lids were being replaced, it was noticed that on the underside of some of the lids were scratch marks made by the poor individual who had clearly been buried alive and where they'd used their nails to try to get out. A horrifying thought. Sadly, in those days it was not easy to truly confirm that someone was dead, so it's almost unthinkable that some individuals were placed in a coffin and buried 6 feet underground, only to wake up in a pitch-black wooden box, feeling an intense cold running through their bones, the smell of dank, damp earth, the sensation of worms and other insects gathering for a feast, and realising the futility of pushing or scratching at the coffin lid, knowing that this time death was inevitable. After these discoveries, it's believed that some burials took place with a piece of string attached to the toes or fingers of the apparent deceased, and on the surface it was tied to a bell, so if they did wake up, they could move and ring the bell. It is believed that a number of people were saved in this way. This practice is also believed to be the source of the phrase dead ringer. Well, after that gruesome tale, we now continue around St Giles and come across an octagonal structure with a stone column in the centre, and it's topped by a white unicorn. This is the Market Cross. This was the name given to the Market Cross and was constructed in any Scots town which had been authorised to hold a regular market or fair. It gave them the status of a borough. This right was given by the monarch, a bishop or a baron, and effectively marked a town's central gathering point where merchants would meet to conduct business. Around the Market Cross was where market stalls would be gathered for market day. It was also the place of public proclamations to ensure the townsfolk were kept informed. The most recent proclamation at this Edinburgh Market Cross was on the death of Her Majesty the Queen and for Prince Charles to become king. And here is that proclamation.
Do now hereby with one voice publish and proclaim that the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign, happy of memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Charles III, by the grace of God, King, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with humble affection.
And that was the official town crier at Edinburgh's Market Cross. Now, directly opposite the Market Cross and set back from the High Street is the City Chambers, which is the formal offices of the Council and Lord Provost of Edinburgh, effectively the Mayor's office. But it was originally built as the Royal Exchange, and it hoped that merchants would use it to do their business in grander surroundings. Well, it never caught on, and the merchants continued to meet at the Market Cross and conduct business in the open. Eventually, the building was taken over by the Council and is used today for local government. Walking down from the City Chambers and on the right-hand side, you'll see a 10-foot tall statue on a massive plinth of the great economic theorist Adam Smith, who is remembered for his most famous work, The Wealth of Nations. The statue's position is most appropriate right in the middle of the merchants' area, looking down the Cannon Gate where he lived and where he is buried. An incredible individual and a stalwart of the Scottish Enlightenment period. We continue down the High Street to the traffic lights and cross the road. On the right-hand side is the Tron Kirk, or church, built in 1647, really is an extension to St Giles due to the overpopulation of Edinburgh. The word Tron is Old Scots for a weigh beam, and merchants would have had to have had their meat weighed before it went to market. Any trying to cheat the system could have resulted in their ears nailed to the Tron, or indeed the Market Cross. As you continue down the High Street on the left-hand side, you will come to John Knox's house. And that's the religious reformer I've just talked about who's buried under the car park at St Giles. This house was built around 1490 and, as you'll see from the architecture, is clearly from that period and includes a 4-stair red pan tiles on the roof and gables. Inside you'll find a wooden gallery and a hand-painted ceiling. It's not known how long Knox would have lived here, but he certainly would have known the building quite well. On the front of the house is a plaque with the words, "Love God above all, and your neighbour as yourself." There is a small statue of Moses and this is thought to be Knox, but that's pure conjecture. The house has certainly lived through famous times, and the marriage lintel with the initials of James Mossman and Mariotta Arras are on the front of the house. Now, Mossman was a goldsmith and became involved in holding Edinburgh Castle during a siege and minting gold coins for the imprisoned Mary Queen of Scots. When the castle was retaken, he was executed for treason. We soon come to the end of the high street at the next set of traffic lights with the World's End pub on the right-hand side. It was called the World's End because this effectively was where the world ended as far as the Edinburgh citizens were concerned. This was the limit of Edinburgh City, and the Netherbour Port, or gate, was situated here. This is one of 6 main gates into the city. On crossing the road, we come into the Cannon Gate, which in medieval times was a separate borough from Edinburgh. The Cannon Gate takes its name from the Canon's Walk, i.e. gate is spelt G-A-I-T, and of course the canons were monks and not some destructive military weapon with loud bangs. Just thought I'd clarify that. So heading down the Cannon Gate, we come to the Old Tolbooth Tavern and the Old Tolbooth built in 1591. It really stands out as an odd-looking building, with small turrets at the top and a large clock on the outside, and, at the time, was the centre of administration and justice of the separate borough of the Canongate, which, as I mentioned, was outside the walls of Edinburgh town. It remained a municipal building until 1856. Today it's now occupied by the People's Story Museum. I was just looking at the type of prisoner held in the Old Tolbooth back in the 17th century and came across a book by David Dobson, which is a directory of Scots banished to the American plantations 1650 to 1775, and one entry reads as follows: Bryce, Malcolm, Covenanter, prisoner at Canongate Tolbooth, banished to the plantations of Virginia 1685. Covenanters were involved in religious wars, well, what's new, and tried to protect their Presbyterianism against the imposition of the Anglican service in Scotland. It's a bit more complicated than that, but you get the gist anyway, and another subject for a podcast. Anyway, if any of my American or Australian listeners have found that their ancestors were banished from Scotland, they may well have spent their last nights here before being deported. Moving on, and our next stop is the Canongate Kirk, or church, a lovely building with a long and important history. The church was actually started in 1688 by King James VII, and his coat of arms should have adorned the front elevation. However, James was deposed by William of Orange, and it was the royal arms of this new king that were placed there instead. James VII's supporters became known as the Jacobites. Effectively, James in Latin is Jacobus, therefore the name Jacobites. And from 1688 until 1746, there was an effective civil war between the Jacobites and the government, ending in the Jacobite destruction at the Battle of Culloden. I'll be covering the Jacobite saga in a future podcast, so watch this space. There are many interesting features inside the kirk, and one is the baptismal font at the front of the church. Now, Roman Catholic and Anglican churches usually have their font at the entrance, whereas the old Scots custom was to have the baptism right in front of the people. The Canongate Church has a bracket set into the foot of the pulpit upon which the baptismal font would sit, and at the appropriate time of baptism, the father would hold up the child and the minister would bend forward to conduct the ceremony from his pulpit. Above the bracket is the royal coat of arms, unveiled by our late Queen Elizabeth in 1991, showing the continued royal connection to this church. Indeed, there have been a few royal weddings here as well, and the last one was Princess Anne's daughter, Zara Phillips, to the famous England rugby player, Mike Tindall. Of course, a visit to the kirk also requires a walk around the ancient graveyard to see some of the most famous people who were laid to rest here. A few include Adam Smith, the economist who I mentioned earlier, David Rizzio, secretary to Mary Queen of Scots, dragged out of Queen Mary's sitting room and brutally murdered in 1566 by a jealous husband and a group of his supporters. It's reported that he had 57 stab wounds, so you just get the feeling that the perpetrators wanted him dead. There is also the grave of Agnes Mackelhouse, and who is that, you might be thinking? Well, it was one of Robert Burns' Scotland's most famous poet lovers. It's believed that they never consummated the relationship, but we'll never know. She was known as Clarinda in Robert Burns' love poems, and the song I Fond Kiss was written for her. I fond kiss, and then we sever. I farewell, and then forever. Deep in heart-wrung tears I'll pledge thee. warring sighs and groans I'll wage thee. Had we never loved so kindly, had we never loved so blindly, never met or never parted, we had ne'er been broken-hearted. When you leave the kirk, you turn left and walk to the bottom of the Cannon Gate, and you'll find the Scottish Parliament building on the right-hand side, and that was opened in 1998. Look straight ahead and you see the magnificent Holyrood Palace. If you walk to the palace gates and look through, you will see this wonderful building as a place fit for kings and queens. Look to the left of the building, and at the back you can just see an old ruin. This was the original building, and the start of the building in 1128, when Holyrood Abbey was founded. It's said that King David I was out hunting and was thrown from his horse when a large stag appeared in front of him, and he was in danger of being gored by its antlers. Now David, whose mother was Saint Margaret, was carrying a wooden crucifix around his neck, and that was believed to be made from a part of the cross of Jesus. And when he held the crucifix up to the stag, it disappeared. For that saviour, he had the abbey built, and if you look above the gates, you will see a stag with a cross between its antlers. The abbey had royal apartments attached, and these were comfortable reprieve from the cold and windy castle up on the hill. In the mid-16th century, King James V, who was father of Mary Queen of Scots, extended the apartments and built the first tower that you see on the left-hand side of the palace. It was this tower where Rizzio, Mary's secretary, was brutally murdered, and, for good measure, they threw his body out of an upper window. A similar tower was built on the right-hand side in the middle of the 17th century, which gives it a uniformity of today. The building is still a working palace, and the King or Queen will stay here on their official visits to Scotland. And you can always tell when they're in residence by the royal standard or the royal flag will be flying at the flagpole, and, of course, the palace will be closed. Well, a separate podcast on the palace is on my list, but if you'd like to hear about it sooner, then please get in touch and let me know. Well, that's that. And we're at the bottom of the Royal Mile, and that brings to an end my overview of the Old Town, where I covered most of the prominent buildings. However, there's a lot more to see, and for a more comprehensive look, it would be better to come and visit Edinburgh for yourselves. I wouldn't dream of plugging my business on this podcast, but if you want a private tour of the city when visiting Scotland, then go to my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, and fill in the contact form. Of course, the city has also grown well beyond the walls of the old and the new towns, with much more to see and experience, but I hope this short tour has given you a good insight as to how Edinburgh was born. After listening to my next podcast on the new town, you'll get an appreciation of how the city has grown into the world-renowned international metropolis that it is today. I have to say, Edinburgh is probably one of my favourite cities in the world, and I have visited many. It's not that big, it's a university town with a youthful vibrancy about it. It's got a fabulous focal point with the castle towering above the city. And as I mentioned, I was brought up in a small village about 10 miles south of the city, and almost every weekend I would travel into town on the bus and go swimming with some of my school friends at the swimming pool in Bath Street. When we finished, we'd get some fish and chips, then head into the Museum of Scotland and spend a few hours walking around the incredible exhibitions and artefacts from around the world, with dinosaur skeletons, miniature working industrial models, and so much more. Even today, I still get a kick out of walking the museum floors, and now there's a brand new museum attached focusing on Scotland. I often ponder if my meanderings around the museum at such a young age gave me the desire to travel the world and see all these wondrous things for myself. Well, folks, that's the end of this tour of Edinburgh's Old Town, and I hope you've enjoyed wandering down the Royal Mile of this fine city with me. I was in Edinburgh last week to take some up-to-date photos, so have a look on my Facebook page and website to see those. To ensure you get notification of all my Unique Scotland podcasts, please go to my website, Exclusive Scottish Visits, on the podcast page and click on the email subscribe button to register. Or you may be listening to Unique Scotland on one of the many podcast channels such as Apple, Spotify, or even YouTube. In any case, don't forget to subscribe to hear much more of this amazing country. As always, I've thoroughly enjoyed bringing a part of Scotland to you. I always welcome feedback, so if you wish to comment on any of these areas that we visited today or any other podcast, then please get in touch. A wee shout out to David Sell from the USA, actually in Voorhees, New Jersey, who emailed recently to let me know that he listened to my North Coast 500 podcast series on his drive, which takes him on a scenic wooded back road. David, Kelly and their 2 children, Lucy and Molly, should have joined me for a tour in 2020, and everything was set. Then COVID happened. So David and Kelly, hope we can reorganise something in the future. Oh, and do bring back Gary and Susan Sheeb, the grandparents, who toured with me a few years ago when we had a fabulous trip around the Highlands. And thank you for your encouragement, David. I most certainly will be continuing my podcasting. I would also like to mention Mary Ann Edwards and her husband Jeff, who are touring with me in September. Mary Ann is the author of the crime thriller books, The Charlie McClung Mysteries, and a jolly good read if I may say so. And I can confirm I'm not on commission to say that. Well, not yet anyway. So, now you have toured the old town, the next podcast will look closely at the new town, where we'll hear about the building of a fabulous new town for the rich and powerful, which has been preserved and recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I'll tell you about the Scott Monument, the second largest monument to any writer in the world, Sir Walter Scott, just smaller than the José Martí Monument in Havana, and of the Queen, who went into hiding for 3 years after her husband died, and how she wore black for the rest of her life, and of the feature film that depicts her with a servant who could have been the saviour of her life, if not her lover. Well, I get a great deal of pleasure bringing you these podcasts, and I'm delighted to have met many of you who have listened to them. Some of you have come on tour with me, and others who cannot travel have sent lovely messages of support for allowing them to enjoy Scotland from the comfort of their armchair at home. And there's another group who have listened to my podcasts and they've come to Scotland and decided to do their own thing. Oh, and also try their hand at driving on the wrong side of the road. They've taken advantage of my personal bespoke itinerary service with personalised support and backup. So if that interests you, get in touch. And a shout out to John Spoden, an avid listener to Unique Scotland podcasts, who recently took advantage of the bespoke itinerary service. I'm looking forward, John, to seeing you up in the Highlands. As always, it's been a blast and a great pleasure to have you all listening today and sharing my wonderful country with you. I would now like to sign off in traditional Scottish fashion by raising a glass to you wherever you are in the world. Slàinte.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.